You know, if you look at modern aviation today, you're pretty much sold this majestically romanticized narrative of human ingenuity. We really like to think of human flight as this grand, calculated conquest of the skies, right? Like it was a steady, inevitable march of pristine scientific brilliance. But if we actually look at the source material, the truth is, well, it's far less majestic. In this explainer, we're going to tear down that polished history and expose it for what it truly is: a chaotic, highly questionable series of trial and error hacks, lucky household accidents, and some incredibly desperate backyard engineering.
And this brings us to a rather uncomfortable question. How exactly did we get from ancient kings using literal meat on a stick as a propulsion system to the sterile, multi-billion-dollar corporate monopolies that dictate modern air travel? I mean, it is an escalation arc of pure absurdity, and honestly, understanding it completely changes how you view that metal tube you sit in at 30,000 feet. Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, Myths and Meat Sticks.
So, if we look at the very earliest records of human hubris regarding the sky, we have to go way back to ancient Greece and ancient Persia, pre-347 BC. The original ideas behind man-made flight were born not in laboratories but in fables. And we essentially find two primary ancient flight hacks. Over on the Greek side, we have the famous myth of Icarus. His father Daedalus uses feathers and wax to build giant wings. Icarus flies too close to the sun, the wax melts, and we get this beautiful poetic tragedy about the limits of man. Classic, right? But then, look at the Persian approach. Found in the epic poem Shahnameh, this one is deeply cynical and literally mechanical. The mythological Shah Kai Kavos of Greater Iran didn't bother with wax. He built a craft with 4 poles pointing outwards, stuck pieces of meat on top of each pole, and chained live eagles to the bottom. When the eagles desperately flapped to reach the meat on a stick, the throne lifted into the sky. And according to the myth, he actually successfully used this system to travel to China. So no poetic tragedy here, just weaponized poultry.
Moving on to Section 2, Defying Gravity via Drawing Laundry.
Because surely the scientific breakthrough of the hot air balloon had to be the result of intense mathematical calculation, right? Not quite. The monumental breakthrough that unlocked human flight was, in fact, a completely mundane household accident. Joseph Montgolfier, who was a highly respected French inventor, was literally just watching his laundry dry over a fire. As his pants dried, he noticed the pockets incidentally billowing upwards from the heat. And that was it. That was the spark of genius. He immediately tested this by building a box-like chamber out of thin wood and taffeta cloth, lit a controlled fire under it, and just watched it rise. So they obviously scale it up. Joseph and his brother Jacques built this giant globe-shaped balloon made of sackcloth, tightened with 3 layers of paper on the inside. And 1,800. That massive number is exactly how many buttons were required to hold their giant sackcloth and paper balloon together. There were no advanced rivets here, no aerospace welding, just 1,800 buttons and a fishing net draped over the outside so the whole thing wouldn't immediately tear apart in the wind. By September 1783, they were ready to test a 37,500 cubic foot balloon called the Aerostat Réveillon in front of King Louis XVI. But, before risking actual human beings, they needed to prove that the upper atmosphere wouldn't spontaneously kill earthly creatures. So their very first airborne crash test dummies were a sheep, a cockerel, and a duck. They strapped these poor farm animals in, launched them from the royal palace in Versailles, and after an 8-minute flight, they landed 2 miles away, perfectly unharmed. So yeah, livestock officially conquered the skies before we ever did. The crucial point here is that humans quickly followed. But as the technology shifted from hot air to hydrogen balloons, which was thanks to the Robert brothers and Professor Jacques Charles, the altitudes got much higher. On a solo flight, Jacques Charles actually hit around 9,800 feet. And humanity's immediate reward for breaking the bounds of Earth, discovering terrifying ear pains and instant altitude sickness. The sky, it turned out, actively hurt to be in. Which brings us right into the 20th century, Section 3, the bicycle parts breakthrough.
Now we're moving away from majestic balloons and straight into the era of explosive, trial-and-error backyard engineering with the Wright brothers. We tend to treat the Wright Flyer like it's this holy relic of engineering, but let's actually break down the recipe. Step 1, symmetrical wings made out of standard spruce wood. Step 2, a measly 12-horsepower gasoline engine. Step 3, to power the counter-rotating propellers, they literally just used sprocket chains stripped straight from traditional bicycles. I mean, the miracle of flight was cobbled together with bicycle mechanics. But let's be real, the majesty of early flight usually involved plummeting headfirst into the dirt. We completely forget that the Wright brothers spent years just crashing in the cow pastures of Huffman Prairie in Dayton, Ohio. They literally had to build a catapult just to get the plane up to a sufficient speed. And on July 14, 1905, Orville Wright tested the Wright Flyer 3, which promptly ended in a serious nosedive crash that severely damaged the plane and injured him. So what did they do after that? They applied a frantic series of patches just to keep from falling out of the sky. They desperately doubled the size of the elevator and the rudder. They strapped on a larger fuel tank, put the rudder on a completely separate control handle, expanded the skids underneath, and just slapped 2 radiators on the front and back struts to stop the engine from overheating. This was absolutely not elegant design. This was brute force survival engineering. But, it worked, and it allowed Wilbur to fly for over 39 minutes later that year. All right, on to Section 4, Aces, Expatriates, and Aluminum. Very soon, the wooden backyard projects were over. The outbreak of the World Wars violently shifted aviation from a curious hobby into a grim industrial and social reality. Airplanes were suddenly armed with machine guns, and the era of the dogfighting ace began. But while the military-industrial complex was booming, domestic society was lagging painfully behind, leading to a massive social brain drain. Consider Bessie Coleman. In the United States, despite her absolute clear talent, flight schools were utterly closed to her due to sheer prejudice. So what did she do? She learned French, traveled all the way across the Atlantic to Paris, and on June 15, 1921, she became the first African-American woman to earn a piloting license. The U.S. literally forced its top aviation talent to flee to Europe just to sit in a cockpit. Which brings us to our final era, Section 5, Hypersonic Speed and Corporate Greed. The whole DIY charm of the 19th and early 20th centuries violently dies right here, and military-industrial overkill essentially takes the wheel. The timeline of this acceleration is frankly frantic. Global warfare mutated aviation at a terrifying pace. In 1915, Hugo Junkers invents all-metal airships, shifting the world away from fragile wood and cloth into sleek aluminum. By 1947, Chuck Yeager is strapping into the rocket-powered Bell X-1 and violently punching through the sound barrier. And then, literally just 20 years later, in 1967, the rocket-powered X-15 aircraft sets the ultimate hypersonic record. And what exactly was that record? 4,534. That is the brain-melting speed in miles per hour achieved by the X-15. Just think about that. We went from laundry fires and 12-horsepower bicycle engines to hurling a metal tube through the atmosphere at over 4,500 miles per hour in just over 50 years. So what is the grand culmination of this entire chaotic chain of eagles chasing meat, 1,800 buttons, catastrophic cow pasture nosedives, and military dogfights? Well, the result was a massive post-World War II commercial boom. The technology stabilized just enough to be monetized, leading directly to the rise of massive multi-billion-dollar corporate monopolies like Boeing, who now completely dictate how, when, and where modern humanity travels. Which leaves us with a rather provocative final thought. We've traced the sanitized history of human innovation today, and we've found it entirely ridiculous at its core. So, going from eagles chasing meat on a stick to multi-billion-dollar monopolies, what completely absurd, accidental DIY hack is going to be the one to conquer the stars next? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and honestly, I hope you never look at a commercial flight the same way again.